Just making sure that I get this posted that we're live on Rumble at, there it is. Trying to find it in my notes. All right. Headset on. And we're going to be jamming. Okay. We'll turn our sound on. And the stage. All right. I should be back. Can you hear me now? That should have worked. Settings, audio, sound card. Oh, can you hear me? Yes, yes. Okay. All right. Yay. All right. So now, oh, echo. Let's try this. Let me get my headphones back on. All right. Is that better? Is the echo still there? Let me know if the echo's still there. All right. How about now? No echo? We good? Thank you for hanging in there, everybody. Okay. So do me a favor, give us a thumbs up on the Rumble. And if you are not following us, please do. It allows our Operation Gladio information to get out there. I'm committed to making sure that everybody in the United States 300 and some million people finally figure out what's going on with Operation Gladio, and it does seem like every single day, thanks to people like Bridget, who's out there searching the archives, that this has been talked about so much, and we didn't even know that it was being talked about. Um, and hopefully y'all saw the post. We can go over a couple of them at the end of the show that Bridget did some awesome digging and, found some information, just, uh, blew me away. So, we're gonna finish up the last section of chapter 9 and plow through chapter 10 because that's the end of the first book, and, we'll go into volume 2 in our our future podcast. So let's hit the material. So chapter 9 was about high-tech treason. We went over a lot of the different ways that these characters, all eventually linking to both Operation Gladio and to Epstein, used high tech, both Mossad, CIA, and all of the different people. So, the subsection of high-tech treason, the last one that we didn't get to was from Cold Wars to hot money, and those of you that's been with me through our whole Operation Gladio series knows all about Cold War and hot money, because the Cold War was used as an excuse, big bad Soviet Union, which the Bolsheviks were, that is part of the Soviet, history, the communists were all funded by Wall Street. So, Wall Street's intention all along, from a fascist standpoint, was to create these, large corporations and use the communist threat to destabilize the entire world and basically take it over. And we're seeing we've lived this whole experience, um, because the majority of it has happened in our lifetime. It didn't start in our lifetime, but we saw all um, types of um, fallout from it. So you have the Soviet Union, which the Gladio units and their operators, their controllers, said, "Oh, if you elect this person or that person, or you don't allow us to implement this law, then you're gonna be invaded by communism." Communism was always the threat, and I'm not saying that communists are, is a good economic policy. It is not. But I am saying that communist is something that was created by the people of the fascist international. I call it the international syndicate. And those people did it in order to have a left and a right in order to cattle prod us into the railroad car. So, this kind of fits right into it, and we know that the whole Gladio, apparatus was, quote, unquote, "anti-communist." So, they used terror, blamed communists, which were never the ones perpetrating the terror, and folded that into, um, a scare operation in order to get you to vote for who they want you to vote for. And it was basically a government within a government that was never gonna not be in power. And we've been living that here in the United States for over 100 years, but under the Gladio auspices after World War II. Okay, so having said that, um, she starts this subchapter off with the fall of the, Soviet Union in 1991. Um, Maxwell spent quite a bit of time in Moscow around that same time. Maxwell being Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's dad, who works for Mossad. He also works for, the UK MI6 as well. Um, he was negotiating the purchase of about $1 billion worth of gold. The sellers were reportedly KGB officers, and the outcome of the exchange was, very secret. So, he goes to Ma he goes to Moscow to secure the gold, only to discover that it has been, quote, unquote, "lost." So and he is there on behalf of Mossad. However, according to this one author, Tom Bowers' biography of Robert Maxwell, the gold actually was had found its way to Israel. So, it wasn't really lost after all. So, you have Israel that is, gobbling up gold from the Soviet Union. And the reason why this becomes important is because you remember, Safra, the guy that was the banker that had the bank in, Switzerland that got burned alive. He's Jewish, and he worked on behalf of Mossad as well as a money launderer. So, you have and he also worked in, with the Browards, that was the whole Magnitsky Act, that were basically going into the, lead up to the fall and the fall of the Soviet Union and buying up all of the privatized businesses there on behalf of their hedge fund, globalist, internationalist order. That's how they were going to overthrow Russia. They were going to buy up all of Russia's assets for pennies on the dollar when the Iron Curtain fell, and they had this all mapped out to do it. But there were a few things that got in their way, Putin being one of them. But the whole Magnitsky Act and the Browards of his lawyer getting killed, that's all BS. That was a story that we were told to be able to sanction Russia in the Magnitsky Act with the hope of being able to destroy Russia economically. That was all a big setup. So and if you understand this whole Operation Gladio, the destabilization of these countries, like in Brazil, was so that the global international syndicate could come in and buy up all of their resources and all of their companies, so that you have this, uh, basically monolith international fascist entity that controls the entire world, and you can't just go in and start buying up companies because they wouldn't be able to afford it. unless they destabilize it first with Gladio operations and terror operations, destroy it. If at all possible, go to war there, destroy the entire thing, because then they build it back the way they want it with them owning it, because they will eventually own it. They'll loan people money to go in there and build, but they'll foreclose on that loan because they will continue to destabilize it until basically they own it. So, that's what's going on here, and, the important part of this area was to understand that Robert Maxwell, Mossad, and the CIA are all involved in it. So, throughout '91, stories of massive outflows of Soviet gold circulated about, the mi with many naming sums considerably higher than even the 1 billion mark. The Manchester Guardian said that a package worth 12 billion had been moved from Russia outside of normal export channels. Several months later, a Russian economist tapped by Gorbachev to help oversee the Soviet economic reforms told stunned world leaders at a G7 summit that Russians' gold reserves had dwindled from 2,000 to 3,000 tons down to 240 tons. Even before the Soviet Union collapsed, looting had been started on a colossal scale. A woman by the name of Claire Sterling wrote a book called Thieves' World. According to her, an army of strange and dubious figures descended upon Europe in 1991, all offering to sell massive amounts of Russian gold. A guy by the name of Leo Wanta was a American mob-linked con man. He was in league with several other mob and faceless investors. He blanketed trading houses across the globe with faxes offering to sell 2,000 tons of gold. At the same time, Roberto Capallo, an Italian boasting credentials identifying him as a member of the Knights of Malta, which we know is intricately involved in Operation Gladio, trying to sell off the exact same amount of gold. Cap Capala Capala was the source of all the gold that Wanta was offering. Were there any links between the Wanta Capala gold sales and Maxwell's attempt to buy up Soviet gold? She points to a thing called the Atlas dossier that we talked about back in chapter 7, which outlined a criminal network connected to the Belgian, Costa Rican diplomat Felix Przeworski. The dossier's named an American company named the New Republic as one of the vehicles through which Przeworski's group laundered money. Mostly profits accrued through the arms and drug trafficking, which is Operation Gladio. Documents reproduced in her book show that Wanta, Wanta, was offering the gold through the US-based company New Republic, which also went by New Republic/USA Financial Group Limited. That portion was in Austria. So, I also looked up this Wanta guy, and he's very interesting. He was convicted, um, of wrongdoing, and it was in '95, and it was upheld in '99 because he appealed it. He was technically a a Somalian ambassador to Canada, but people believe he was in that status to give him, immunity, and he also worked with, Mark Rich and some of the same people that were tied to Osama bin Laden, and Mark Rich, we know unequivocally was, involved in the CIA. So, the Leo Wanta thing, there's a big, long story about how he was a good guy and he was trying to get money back for the US government. I don't know what the real story is, but there's definitely a story there. So, the Atlas dossier is what identified Safra, the guy who burned up, um, Safra's Republic National Bank as one of the money laundering outlets. There was also a reason that the dossier had been drafted in the first place. The looting-induced collapse of a company called Comuel, Comuele, SA, by the associate of Przeworski's group. According to the dossier, this Comuel had been taken over by Russians and injected with money from Israel. During the 1980s, Comuel was owned by LONRHO, Lonho, which we've talked about repeatedly, the corporation flagship of Maxwell's friend, Tiny Roland, that small group again. So you have the same people that's involved in this whole Russian gold story that we've ran across time after time after time. Eastern Bloc's established trading companies with corporate fronts, with obscured behind wall ownership, front companies. They learned well from the CIA. Um, East German's Coco, KOKO, was an example. Kintex, which we've talked about before, in Bulgaria, which Maxwell certainly would have known about, um, is another example, and we talked about Kintex before. Bulgaria is the Gladio company that was the hub for all of the illegal arms sales. There These and entities like the Bulgaria's Multi-Group, which is the name of it, Multi-Group, subsequently became conduits for the capital flow out of the Eastern Bloc as Soviet Union collapsed. Maxwell's role in Multi-Group shows his direct involvement in these activities. He supposedly had struck a deal with the KGB chief to help manage the Secret Service economic fronts in Europe and elsewhere. So basically, the KGB wants seeks out Maxwell to set up the same kind of and what's interesting about this, as bad as everybody said the communists were, they did not have an extensive network of front companies, and not that they didn't money launder or that they didn't do bad things, but they did not have the finesse as the Mossad, MI6, and the US because they didn't have to. So, our spy agencies have to set up false fronts and false banks and false companies in order to trick us because we watch what they do, and we could have taken measures to hold them accountable if you believe in democracy. Russia never had to do that because they didn't have to do that. They do whatever they wanted, and they just kill people, okay? So, trust me, I'm not saying communism is good, but you have no need to set up front companies and do things behind people's back because they can't elect anybody different. You're just gonna get killed if you talk about it. So, kinda like here now, so much for democracy. So, Russia wanted Maxwell to help them set up front companies so they could start hiding behind them as well, which I just thought was hilarious. So, um, one of the guys that was helping, um, was a guy by the where's he at? Um, so you've got Latvia helping, Russia, and Liechtenstein, and a place called the Isle of Man all have obscure offshore financing where you can do money laundering. So, according to intelligence sources, 2 authors, who've written about this also said Nordex was deeply involved in arms, drugs, and the quote unquote "whole 9 yards." This also entails the trade of nuclear materials such as uranium, plutonium, and beryllium. Nordex's co-founder was Mark Rich. Just let that sink in. So, another author in his book, King Energy, said that Rich utilized Nordex to snap up Russian oil refineries that were being auctioned off during the post-economic transition. Another player in Nordex was a guy by the name of Isso Lenzlinger, Lenzlinger. He's a financial juggler. He was on the board of over 100 different companies. So you know that he's a big, um, mover and shaker as far as, getting money laundered where it needs to be. So, I'm just trying to get through here, and so because some of these names will come up again, I just wanna introduce us to 'em. Nordex's money laundering activities linked it to a company registered in New Jersey and active in New York City called Benex International, Benex, and they were located in Queens and shared the same building with 2 other companies connected to a guy by the name of Lochan Lodchansky. Loutchansky. So, authorities investigating Russian mob-linked money laundering activities also found fingerprints of Mark Rich at Benex. Wire transfers were discovered between Benex and Glencore of Rich, though both Rich and Glencore denied that they ever got money from them, but they're pretty sure it happened. Benex moved as much as $9 billion through a handful of companies in Paris, all of which had the same office address. That's a true sign of money laundering. So, um, there's another one, Kama Trade, Kama, that was managed by this Lenzinger guy and partners, a trust headed by Isso Lenzinger. Um NX also arose in investigations into financial activities of Maxwell's most notorious criminal associate, Semyon Milekovich. Money had been moved through bank accounts held by Benex to YB Magnet International, a Pennsylvania company that had merged with a large Hungarian firm that sold industrial magnets and military hardware. YBM was firmly under the control of Milogovic and had been capitalized with funds from Aragon, Arigon, the heart of his criminal empire. Within 4 years of it launching, it became a billion-dollar company. Canadians let's see, ambitious plans to use the Canadian stock market as a means of money laundering by publicly traded shell companies. Um, that turned out not to work very well for them. Vinex was part of a complicated money laundering network that encompassed Milosevic and a number of Russian oligarchs, newly minted private banks operating wildly in unregulated markets. The company had been formed by a guy by the name of Peter Berlin and his wife, Lucy Edwards, an officer of the Eastern European Division of the Bank of New York. The Bank of New York, plays very heavily in this money laundering scheme at that time. I'm not gonna go into all of the details, but there's a big meeting that they have in Minnesota with Gorbachev, um, and have during some of the discussions about businesses, we have a guy by the name of Burton Cantor, who was the um, banking partner of Paul Helliwell, who is of the CIA. Um, also, let's see, another bank that was, tied to the Bank of New York was European Union Bank, EUB. Um, they were part of the Russian organized crime money laundering, um, during this time, and let me see if there's anybody else down here. Um, so they were sending these things called, um, ciphergrams, which were encrypted communications to allow for direct interactions between those Eastern European Bank of New York branches and their main branch back in the United States. The cybergrams and the database systems were part of an effort to keep a technique created by Finkel, the manager of Incom Bank, INCOMBANK, one of New York Bank of New York's Russian clients, um, and a mysterious individual called Bob Klein, um, and here's a quote. After a major investment was placed by a Russian customer in Income Bank or one of its satellite offshore companies, Bank of New York would execute a series of electronic fund transfers from the Income Bank US dollar accounts to specific offshore front companies and bank accounts. Usually, several layers of these electronic fund transfers to offshore entities were executed in succession, hence the name spinning around like a laundromat. The ultimate goal of the spinning around scheme was to obscure and disguise the true origin of the funds being moved through the Bank of New York account. The spinning around scheme allowed income bank customers to evade payment of Russian taxes and duties and provide the ability to launder proceeds to illegal acts. The conspirators generated commissions, payment, or a skim based on the percentage of the amount being moved around. The commissions were also referred to as a consulting fee, were ultimately diverted for the benefit of the conspirators through the Bank of New York to offshore entities. So, the important thing to understand here is basically they are raping Russia. They are and that's what the whole, uh Magnitsky and the Broward was all about. They were going to suck Russia dry, but in walks, um, Putin eventually that put a nix to the entire operation, and then that's like I said, when they enacted the Magnitsky Law that basically tried to sanction all of them and penalize them for not allowing US companies to further rape and pillage Russia. That's literally what this is all about. It is to allow this international fascist controlling mechanism own everything and we own nothing. And every time somebody gets in their way right, that's exactly why they hate Russia, Bridget, and that's why everybody needs to understand. Russia has been a thorn in their side forever. The people of Russia, back when they had to kill the Tsar, would die for their royal family. They didn't like their royal family, they didn't like the living conditions, but culturally, they had lived under that system and would die for it. The They wanted to be free, but not under a Bolshevik communist freedom, and there were patriots in Russia that fought against the Bolsheviks. Even after the Tsar had been murdered, there was a general that was in the Siberian area that was still fighting. You know what we did? We fought against him. We armed the Bolsheviks. We made sure their freedom fighters were murdered because we wanted to use the communist in order to take over the rest of the world. The communists were placed in Russia at the behest of the fascists that were running the round table and the society for creating this boogeyman that they could get the rest of the world conquered by the threat of the communists, "Oh my gosh, we gotta go to Vietnam because communism is gonna spread. Oh my gosh, we gotta go to Korea because communism is gonna spread. Oh my gosh, we gotta go into Cuba because communism is gonna spread." It has been the, go-to bully pulpit that they've used to do everything that has destroyed everything else. So, um, that pretty much locks us up with the rest. Um, yeah, so there's a whole network of I was just reading my note. Without going into a lot of detail, the IMF, the banks in New York, the US Federal Reserve in 1992 went and set up a bunch of banks in Russia to include a central bank in order to launder all of the money that they're going to try to take out. Um, they tried to get, Russia to take out all of these IMF loans for rebuilding, and basically they then just steal the dollars. So and they do that with all of the African countries too. So down one of the banks I wanted to get back to the whole Safra thing. Um, the Bank of New York was not the lone recipient of all the Russian money being laundered. It flew in it flowed into accounts in the Republic, um, National Bank, which was Safra's bank, and, um, according to a Russian paper, Edmund Safra was spooked by the financial crisis that had, ensued because of all of this money and what they were doing to Russia, and began turning evidence over to the FBI. While Safra was reported to have had periodic conversations with FBI representatives that lasted almost a year. In 1999, Safra was visited at his French estate by the Russian oligarch Boris Ben Berezovsky, one of Russia's wealthiest individuals and a part of Boris Yeltsin's inner circle. Numerous press reports showed that by August of that year, the probes into the Bank of New York money laundering had ensnared Berezovsky. According to Safra, excuse me, accordingly, Safra and Berezovsky had an increasingly angry conversation that lasted several hours, after which Safra fled in panic to his heavily fortified Monte Carlo residence, and that's the residence that he was burned alive in. So, many people believe that the reason Safra died is because he was actually telling the FBI what was going on inside of Russia. And if you put the Broward account of what happened beside this timeline, it actually is like a perfect match for and as criminal as our FBI is, it could have been the FBI that was telling the whole network, "Hey, this guy's ratting y'all out. We need to get him." I put nothing past any of them at this point. So, that's the end of chapter 9. We're gonna run on over to chapter 10. Chapter 10, Government by Blackmail: The Dark Secrets of the Reagan Era. So, if y'all think Reagan's a good guy, put your ear, plugs in. So, um Iran-Contra promise, BCCI, and related schemes of the Reagan era are clear examples of how an alliance between intel networks and organized crime results in both national and international business, include um, rackets within the criminal element. Much of the dirty laundering of these different criminal enterprises, she says, was being mopped up by the early 1990s by none other than William Barr. Funny how that name keeps coming up. Who started his career at the CIA and served as George H.W. Bush's Attorney General. Barr would play a major role in covering up the Iran-Contra, promised stealing of the software, and BCCI. And for those of you who don't know, BCCI is a Pakistani bank that is used extensively for Operation Gladio and criminal activity. It grew to be the 7th largest bank in the world. So she goes on to say, as seen in his pardoning of the Iran-Contra criminals, his patronage of the BUA report, and his thwarting of indictments related to BCCI's 1991 collapse, respectively. And that is true. Nobody was held accountable for the catastrophic, collapse of the BCCI bank. Intelligence organized crime networks were so central to the national power structure by the time Reagan took office that the more well-known scandals of the era can be seen as business as usual, which is also true. Intimately involved in the world of sex blackmail were key power brokers in the White House who often bragged about their ability to fix or manipulate any politician or powerful individual. One figure emblematic of this was the guy we talked about early on by the name of Roy Cohn, whose ties to sex blackmail, organized crime was kinda central to his whole being. We talked early about his favor bank, modeled after the system of organized crime, and Cohn's birthday party in 1979 was attended by important officials of both Democrat and Republican and conservative on Inc. parties. Um, People like Cy Newhouse, William Safire, and Donald Trump. She's not a big fan of Donald Trump's, among others. The party was hosted at the infamous Studio 54, whose owners were Cohn's clients. Studio 54 was known for its wild parties, semi-naked performers, and culture of open drug use. Vanity Fair once described it as a giddy epicenter of the '70s, basically sexual whatever, um, endless cocaine, every kind of sex, blah, blah, blah. And of course, if Ray Cohen had anything to do with it, it was all filmed. Um, Cohen regularly took judges, elected officials, men and women of influence to this club. He allegedly used a story about a government official's drug use at Studio 54 for political purposes. The official was Hamilton Jordan, Jimmy Carter's chief of staff, and Cohn was widely believed to be the person who leaked details of Jordan's alleged cocaine use at the club to the New York Times. He gained a reputation as a lawyer for kingpins of organized crime, counting major mobsters, um, as his clientele. He developed even more connections, with people like Barbara Walters, who referred to Cohn as, um, a fiancé, um, whom he later introduced to the head of the U.S. Information Agency, Chad Wick, as well as other high rollers in the, Reagan administration. And keep in mind, U.S. Information Agency is a CIA operation as well. Yet Walters was just one of Cohn's powerful friends in the media, a group that also included Abe Rosenthal, executive editor of the New York Times, William Safire, who was a longtime New York Times columnist, George Sko Skokalski, who was of the New York Herald Tribune, NBC, and ABC. Cohn was also, very friendly with Rupert Murdoch, and, we read about that when the whole Iran-Contra was going on. Um, his high school friend, Cy Newhouse Jr., was also in the media, involved in Vanity Fair, Vogue, GQ, and The New Yorker. Um, Cohn's media confidants included William Buckley of the National Review, who is also a CIA agent. Also, um, so and William Buckley would use the National Reserve, Review to attack Cone's political enemies. Um, Buckley, along with Barbara Walters, Alan Dershowitz, and Donald Trump, would later serve as character witnesses for Cone during his 1986 disbarment hearing, and all but Buckley would later draw con controversy for their subsequent connections to Jeffrey Epstein. Now, we know that there's nothing about, Trump's, uh, connection to Jeffrey Epstein, but just take that with a grain of salt. There is a connection there. I mean, he was at parties with them. There's pictures of him sitting on the couch, um, with him and young girls all around, but we can all, for the moment, believe that that was as much intel gathering as anything else, if you believe in things like Operation Greylord, which I do, because that's actually true. And if you don't know what it is, look it up. It's very interesting and gives you lots of hope. So, another guy, Stanley Friedman, a law partner of Cohn, who was later imprisoned over kickback and bribery scandals while serving as the New York deputy mayor, told columnist Marie Brenner in '80 that Roy could fix anything for anyone in the city. Um, okay, so we got all of that. Also, we know that he helped a lot of judges, get appointed. Cohn's involvement in Reagan's 1980 campaign would be critical. Also, Cohn would meet another of his protégés during the 1980 timeframe, which is Roger Stone. Cohn infamously instructed Stone to leave a hefty bribe tucked in a suitcase at the doorstep of the Liberal Party's headquarters during the 1980 campaign, a dirty trick that helped Reagan win the state of New York. Cohn would also meet, Paul Manafort during this time, and he introduced Cohn did, introduced both Stone and Manafort to Donald Trump, which is very interesting because it almost appears like Cohn was trying to set up Donald Trump. Another of Cohn's law partner, Tom Bolan, Bolan, Reagan, named Bolan as director of the Overseas Private Investments Corporation, the government's development finance institution, and that's a big deal because that holds there's a lot of money involved in that, and they basically dictate who they want to get develop money and who they don't. Operation, Greylord, uh, Greylord. It is a sting operation that happened in Chicago, quite a long time ago, where it went on for, like, 7 years. I mean, it was a long time. I think it went on for 5 to 7 years, and then it took them another 2 years to arrest all of the people. It was so compartmentalized. It was basically a takedown of the criminality in Chicago. And it was so compartmentalized that the good judges that were pretending to be bad didn't know who the good and bad prosecutors were coming before them, because they wanted no one to know who anyone else was, so none of it could be compromised. And at the end of the day, they arrested a ton of people for corruption, and I very much believe that's what's happening right now. It has been happening since 2017. In 1989, roughly 3 years after Cohn died, Olin attended a party on Robert Maxwell's yacht, Lady Jocelyn, alongside Donald Trump, literary agent Mort Janklow, who represented Ronald Reagan, and two of Cohn's closest friends, William Safire and Barbara Walters. Olin, like Cohn, was instrumental in securing federal judgeships for many people, to include FBI Director Louis Freeh. Free would later be hired by Epstein's, associate, Alan, Dershowitz, to investigate the Epstein scandal. So, what's interesting about that is these guys all hang around with each other, and then they hire each other to investigate each other. So and that's like what we've said about all of these books that we've read. If Congress has a commission, you can guarantee the commission is to vary whatever and come out with a predetermined outcome, just like they just did with the 1/6 and the Warren Commission and all of them. It's all garbage. It's a waste of our money. If they're forming a commission, it's a piece of crap. They've already decided what the outcome's gonna be. Um, so supposedly Alan Dershowitz was to investigate the Epstein scandal where he allegedly harassed, Epstein's victims, at the end of the day, the child abuse, uh, and the sex trafficking and all of that other stuff. What's interesting in this part is Cohn supposedly also helped get Trump's sister, Mary Ann Trump Berry, appointed to her federal judgeship as well. Trump called Cohn to thank him for pulling the strings on behalf of his sister. There's a footnote there as well. Take that for whatever it's worth. Um, so he worked closely with Reagan's campaign manager and later CIA director William Casey. According to another author, Cohn's long-term switchboard operator from the 1960s up until his death in 1986, who had listened in on all of his calls, um, she said that Casey and Cohn were very good friends and that they talked almost daily. So this lady, that wrote this other book, um, so excuse me, Christine Seymour is the name of his long-term switchboard operator. She attempted to write a book, and guess what happened? We already know the answer based on everything that we've read. So, um, a local columnist wrote that Seymour monitored every call in and out, knew everything that everyone had ever said, and where all of the quote unquote "bodies" were buried. 5 months later, she was killed in a very suspicious car accident, leaving her book unfinished. When Seymour's collaborator on the book, Jeffrey Smith, learned of Seymour's death and the circumstances surrounding it, he panicked and burnt everything. Before her death, she noted that one of Cohn's other most frequent phone, pals was Nancy Reagan, and she was also one of his clients. Reagan, whose influence over her husband was well known, was so close to Cohn that it was largely his death from AIDS that led her to encourage her husband to seek funding for AIDS research. Um, Ronald Reagan himself was also a friend, and according to another journalist, lavished favors on Cohn, including invitations to the White House, thank you notes, birthday wishes, blah, blah, blah. Um, which of course people find interesting because of supposedly Ronald Reagan's image of an evangelistic, person, and we all know that we found out earlier that Ray Cohn was gay at a time when that wasn't cool. But his ties to, the mafia and several other crime syndicates was probably more important, um, to find out that the current president thinks he's a great friend. But we know Reagan's ties to the crime mafia out in Los Angeles as well, we went over that before. Wasserman, the longtime president of MCA, who Reagan worked with, um supporting his successful push to become president of the Screen Actors Guild. MCA was a major finance of Reagan being governor, also during his run for president. Reagan became president. His administration controversially shut down a massive Department of Justice probe into MCA's ties to organized crime. How about that? Did you know that? Quote, Ronald Reagan was an opportunist. His whole career was guided by MCA, by Wasserman and MCA founder Jules Stein, who bragged that Reagan was malleable, that they could do whatever they wanted with him. That thing about Reagan being tough on organized crime, that's a fallacy, unquote. That's according to a documentary that was done. The same guy that did that, cited in a declassified, uh, DOJ document who called Reagan, quote, "a complete slave of MCA who would do his bidding on anything." We know that Lew Wasserman, who was in charge of MCA, joined Mayfield Road Gang, which was run by Mo Dalitz, Dalitz, mobster, and Meyer Lansky, who, per the FBI, were powerful people in the Lansky criminal enterprise. Um, Second only this Mo Dalitz guy was second only to Lansky himself among members of the Jewish mob. Cohn's involvement in United Dye case revealed that he had been involved in Dalit's network since at least the 1960s. Lew Wasserman would later marry Edith Beckerman, whose father was Dalit's attorney. Wasserman's closest friend, Sidney Korshak, also had close ties to Dalit and was partners with Lansky in Acapulco Tower Hotel. Korshak was logically successor to Meyer Lansky's um, crime syndicate. Uh, the DOJ probe into MCA that the Reagan administration quashed had been launched after the Department of Justice learned that an influential member of the Gambino crime family, Pisello, Pisello, was doing business with a massive entertainment company. At the time, the boss of the Gambino family, Paul Castellano, was a client of Roy Co Cohen, sorry. Um, also Eugene Quin Giaquinto had bragged that he was responsible for scuttling the DOJ probe in a wiretap phone call that had to do with the Inslaw affair. So, another figure that, played heavily during the Reagan presidential campaign was our buddy Robert Keith Gray. He's the PR guy that is totally dirty. Um, that was close to CIA William Casey. Gray would go on to co-chair Reagan's inaugural committee. Afterwards, he would return to his PR business, which included Saudi arms dealer Evan Khashoggi and Mossad-linked and hedge fund manager Mark Rich, also CIA linked. Roy Cohn would also take on Khashoggi as a client. I don't think there's any bad guys he didn't have as a client at some point. Um, and also Jeffrey Epstein eventually takes on Khashoggi as a client, for finance purposes, but we're gonna get more into that in the next volume. So you have 3 men tied to different, um, aspects of sexual blackmail would all begin to circle around a man like Khashoggi, who was alleged to have used sexual blackmail himself. However, it begins to look a bit less like a coincidence when one considers that by the '80s, several organizations tied not only to key factions of the Reagan administration, but also to the Iran-Contra would be tied to child sex abuse, sex trafficking, and sex blackmail. More overlap on these networks can be seen at a testimonial dinner hosted by the B'nai B'rith, which is B apostrophe Nia AI, sorry, and then separate word B apostrophe RITH. That is a Jewish secret society, banking and finance lodge at the Grand Hyatt Hotel in New York. The hotel at the time was a project between Donald Trump, Cohn's protege, and the organized crime link Pritzker family that we talked about at length in chapter 1. The Trump-Pritzker partnership dissolved in 1990. It began to dissolve in '93 and was finally ended in formally in 1996. This testimonial dinner was in Ro Roy Cohn's honor, sorry. Um, let's see. So, basically, they had a tribute to him at this B'nai B'rith banking and finance lodge in which they invited the Pritzkers and Donald Trump. It was also noted that he had received honors from the Jewish National Fund, the Federation of Jewish Philanthropies. The latter group, 3 years later, would merge with the United Jewish Appeal, which was intimately connected to the philanthropic activities of Les Wexner, which we'll get into, and Wexner's mentor, Max Fisher. All of these people are Jewish and belong to and gave heavily to all of these, Jewish organizations. The dinner invitation also notes that Cohn had been a longtime member of the Banking and Finance Lodge of B'nai B'rith, continuing a tradition established by his father, Justice Albert Cohn, who was the president of the organization's New York, New England district. And we know that Albert Cohn basically had his judgeship fought for him by his father-in-law in New York. Albert Cohn was a high-ranking member of the B'nai B'rith, the president of its most influential chapter. The New York Times referred to B'nai B'rith organization as one of the most powerful secret organizations in the United States. The seal of secrecy was stamped upon the proceedings, thereby following the example of a Masonic lodge or the secret fraternities associated with colleges. Um, she just wanted to point out that definitely by the 1980s, the leadership of B'rith had become dominated by powerful men with organized crimes and intel connections, and, um, she points out that Albert Cohn, his dad, Roy Cohn's dad, was a good example of that. The B'nai B'rith hosting a dinner for Cohn, the organization's board of overseers included individuals with organized crime, like connections, like Edmund Safra was on there, Edgar Rothman of the Secret Empire, which had clear ties to organized crime, and Les Wexner, clear, ties, as well as Max Fisher, which we will get into. Benai Breath played a crucial role in the creation of Wexner's main philanthropic organization, the Wexner Foundation. More significant about this dinner are the honorary chairman, 8 close friends of Cohn. Some of those are Donald Trump, Rupert Murdoch, Stanley Friedman, George Steinbrenner, Gerald Schofield, Maxwell Rabb, and let's see, um, it says Reb left his secretary to Robert Gray, the PR guy. Um, Rab was also involved in, business with a guy by the name of Jack Cooper, who was a front man for Meyer Lansky's organized crime syndicate. Um, this is interesting. At the time of the 1983 dinner, Raab was the US ambassador to Italy and was later accused of involvement in aspects of the Iran-Contra. Now, what do we know about Operation Gladio? In 1983, they were at the highlight, heyday of the terror operations going on in Italy because the whole thing blew up in 1990. So, this if you go back and you look at all of the ambassadors to the Vatican and the ambassadors to Italy, every single one of them from the early 1950s until 1990 knew and were complicit in Operation Gladio. So, this Rab guy, knee deep in Gladio. Alright. Another one of the guys, in this group was Edward Regan, who was the comptroller of the state of New York from '79 to '93 under Governors Hugh Carey and Mario Cuomo. Regan's role as state comptroller, um, had huge connections to Roy Cohn. Um, Here's a quote. In 1988, prosecutors investigating Mr. Regan's fundraising practices after the disclosure of a memo written by a top aide advocating a policy under which those who give will get, suggesting perhaps that the financial firms that provided the bulk of the comptroller's campaign donations would get state businesses. Um, Another one of them was Alan Greenberg, then chairman of Bear Stearns. He was very tight with Jeffrey Epstein as well. Other close friends at the dinner was Tom Boland, his law partner, William Sapphire, um, Charles Allen of Allen& and Company, which we talked about, Ron Perlman, which that guy's a ugh, bad guy. Ron Lauder of the Estée Lauder fortune, um, who was serving as Reagan's Undersecretary of Defense at the time and had ties to places like, Israel's Discount Bank, and then several senators and congressmen, Strom Thurmond, Jack Kemp, and Arlen Specter, were all at this party in honor of Roy Cohn. So then we move on to Covenant House in Americare. A Catholic priest by the name of Bruce Ritter, um, this is this part's really tough here. So Bruce Ritter, asked his superiors for permission to take homeless teenage boys and girls into his house in Manhattan. He's a Catholic priest. Ritter's account, they agreed during a snowstorm that they could stay over. He sheltered 6 runaway teenagers by hosting them in his apartment. Ritter's activities would, uh, later on, they would claim that they were sexually abused, um, and he was actually, instrumental in creating this Covenant House organization. Ritter was accused of having sexual relationships with some of the teenagers, and spending Covenant House funds on lavish gifts on the teenagers, that he groomed and exploited. As a result, Ritter was forced to resign from Covenant House in February of 1990. Ritter had paid off a male prostitute with Covenant House funds in exchange for sex, was another allegation. 4 more young men later came, um, forward saying that they had been sexually abused, and while they were there seeking services, like, as homeless kids or runaways. One of the victims, Daryl Basile, Bassile, was 14 at the time that this happened, um, and is quoted as saying, "You are wrong for inflicting your desires on a 14-year-old. I know that someday you will stand before the one who judges all of us, and at that time, there will be no more denials, just the truth." So nearly half of the charity's board resigned after these allegations got made. Um The resignations were, related just not to the sex, allegations, but it was also discovered that a secretive fund had been set up by Father Ritter that made loans to 2 board members, who had resigned at that point, notably Charles Sennott, Sennott, the Post reporter who wrote the first story about Ritter's accusers, would later state that the secular powers more than the archdiocese of the Franciscans protected Ritter. So, he knew a lot of powerful people, in other words. Powerful politicians, including, Mario Cuomo, Cardinal John O'Connor, who we came across already, um, intervened to broker a deal between Ritter and the Manhattan District Attorney, Robert Morgenthau. O'Connor's predecessor, Spillman, who we know was one of the people working with Ray Cohn, who they say both of them were gay and went to that, blue suite in New York City and got blackmail material on people. Um, seems to run in that, church up there. So, Robert Morgenthau said that there were not enough evidence of financial misconduct to charge him with that crime. Notably, Covenant House decided to hire CIA of Wall Street Kroll Associates, Kroll, and, the firm is so deeply connected to Thomas Torbley, who we talked about in chapter 4, inde quote, "independently investigate possible financial wrongdoings." Kroll Associates, its longstanding US and Israeli intelligence ties, and Robert Maxwell's hiring of the firm in 1991's death, which we're gonna talk about in a future chapter. So, basically, Kroll is part of the CIA. You will find them in many, many different research projects I've, um, uh, done. You will find Kroll, associated with. So, basically, they got hired to do an investigation, um, and she calls it limited hangout, um, because they're all connected. Kroll Associates claimed that none of the allegations, when viewed individually, could be proved beyond any question, while also claiming that the cumulative evidence against Ritter was excessive. As for Ritter himself, he denied the charges and had told Senate by phone that he had been set up by organized crime. Um, his main Ritter's main patron was a guy by the name of Robert McCauley, Macauley, Bush Senior's roommate at Yale. Let that sink in for just a second. Macaulay was the key figure behind the Covenant House rise and his own interest in humanitarian aid coalesced around the time he began a relationship with Ritter. Macaulay, who first met Ritter in '77, was described by the New York Times as instrumental to Covenant House fundraising after he joined its board, and especially after he became the chairman in 1985. Macaulay as chair of Covenant House operating budget grew from 27,000,000 to $90,000,000, and its board came to include powerful individuals, top executives from IBM, Chase Manhattan, and Bear Stearns. Their alliance led Macaulay and Ritter to jointly grant an audience with John Paul, Pope John Paul II. And keep in mind, we know unequivocally that Pope John Paul II was involved in Operation Gladio. Other wealthy or well-connected people included Williams E. Simon, Treasury Secretary under Nixon and Ford. Simon was also connected to Kissinger Associates and Bechtel. He served on the board of the Gulatis family company, Tamco. Macaulay also introduced Ritter to George H.W. Bush through J. Peter Grace. J. Peter Grace is W.R. Grace Company's, heir, and was president of, W.R. Grace at the time. Ritter met Ronald Reagan, Both Bush and Reagan publicly praised Ritter, including at a State of the Union, address in 1984. Grace, who had not only deeply, um, involved in another nonprofit called AmeriCares, but had donated heavily to Covenant House and once chaired the board of a reported CIA front company called American Institute of Free Labor Development, and was also the former head of United Fruit and United Brands, which is also a CIA front company. United Brands would later be led by Eli Black, father of the corporate raider and Epstein associate Leon Black. After Black's alleged suicide, would be it would the company would be controlled by Leslie Wexner's mentor, Max Fisher, and Alfred Taubman, Taubman, which we're gonna talk about in a future chapter. Macaulay's organization, the AmeriCares Foundation, so now you have Macaulay and Ritter. Ritter had the Covenant House, and Macaulay has his own foundation called AmeriCares. AmeriCares was later accused of, excuse me, funneling money to the Contras in South Central America. Um, he was also basically the main source for Covenant. Bruce Ritter himself was also tied to AmeriCares, serving as vice president of yeah, so they basically are just in bed with each other. I hopefully not literally, but, definitely business-wise. AmeriCare sent more than $291,000 in food and medicine to Nicaragua and 5,000 in cash to the Contra leader Mario Calero in 1985. His board members, aside from Grace and Macaulay, included Trilateral Commission co-founder and National Security Advisor, um, Brezhnev Brzezinski, former Republican Senator Gordon Humphrey, and George H.W. Bush brother Prescott. After George H.W. Bush died, AmeriCares stated that he had been instrumental in founding the health-focused relief and development organization that he has. Um, Another one of the board members, William Simon, former U.S. Secretary of Treasury, who ran the Nicaraguan Freedom Fund for the Contras. He also was involved, with aid that was tied to the Moon Unification Church, and remember, we've already established that Moon Unification Church is part of Operation Gladio in Paraguay. AmeriCares, also funded by the Unification Church, was deeply connected to the Catholic, organization, the Knights of Malta. William Simon, who was Ray Cohn's law partner, let's see, William Simon and Ray Cohn's law partner, Tom Bolin, and the former CIA director, William Casey, were also members of the Knights of Malta. Oh, and J. Peter Grace was the president of the Knights of Malta's American branch. So there's literally, and this is my visual way of thinking about all of this, is you have what I believe to be the lead the head table of you can use the term fascist international, international syndicate, that's my term, at the head table. There's 5 chairs at the head table. There are tables that are like you know how you reserve tables at a big formal dinner? There's a lot of the tables that are underneath that feed up to this main table. The each of those feeder tables have their own next level of so it looks like a mobile hanging, from the ceiling, and each layer gives you bigger and bigger tables of people sitting at the table, whether it's the Trilateral Commission, the Knights of Malta table, and people have multiple chairs at different tables. Somebody might be sitting at both the Knights of Malta table and the Trilateral and the CFR, um, and than these other front things that they call charities or foundations that actually report up to the CFR, because if you look at who sits at the CFR, they're the same guys that are in charge of the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, the, Rockefeller Foundation. Those are just subordinate tables to the CFR. The CFR has a table itself. So you can find people in multiple different, um, tables, and that's literally how you have to look at this. Um AmeriCare had, connections to US intelligence as well. Um, they used, Southern Air Transport for many of their flights for their, aid. They made several, flights during the Gulf War to Kuwait and Iran. Um, Southern Air Transport a few years later was intimately involved in Leslie Wexner's The Limited with Jeffrey Epstein. You're right. Um, Macaulay-Ritter alliance was cemented. Um, the Covenant House seems to become enmeshed in similar intel-linked, networks. The Covenant House grew into an international organization. It had now listen to this. Now, supposedly, this is a charity for runaway kids, okay? Um, they opened branches in Guatemala, and it just so happened to be the guy in charge of that branch was a CIA asset whose plantation had been used to train troops for the Bay of Pigs, invasion of Cuba. His last name is Arzu, Arzu. Um, he's an associate of the US-backed dictator in Nicaragua, who also was a Knights of Malta member. Um, Arzu also worked directly for AmeriCare and Covenant House. Doesn't that sound like a front, organization to you for all of these? And they're trafficking kids, homeless kids. Um, intelligent community sources cited the Franklin cover-up author Don DeCamp, a s oh, excuse me, let me just start that over. John DeCamp, who wrote about the Franklin cover-up, also said that Arzu-led branch of Covenant House procured children for a pedophile ring based in the United States. A few years later, Mi Casa, another US-ran charity in Guatemala that George H.W. Bush had personally toured with his wife, Barbara, was accused of rampant pedophilia and child abuse. So, this is child trafficking right here. And the implications here, given what I just told you about who all of the people were as the director of these organizations, is they're all involved. Okay. Um, so I'm going to assume y'all know about the, Franklin cover-up. Does everybody, has everybody heard about the Franklin cover-up? The Franklin, um, boys town where you had Larry King, the guy that was in charge of a, um, credit union in Omaha, Nebraska, basically was trafficking kids to include flying them in, for late night visits in, Washington, DC, to include the White House. Um, I don't if y'all have already heard about that, I don't wanna go into and spend a bunch of time on that, because it's just another ring of this, blackmail setup. Uh, Bridget, every single large charity, whether it's the Red Cross, um, anything that you think is a charity that's large, the United Way, they're all involved in this. I hate to break that to you, but they're all involved in this. Um, a lot of them at the same time, like this Larry King. every single child, um, and here's yeah, I know you are. Um, the if you look at every single one of these Rockefeller, um, people, um, they all have a child-focused charity. Every one of every one of them has easy access to children. Same thing with Oprah, with her school that she set up over in Africa, and then all of these girls end up missing. It's just disgusting. Um, so anyway, I'm not gonna spend a whole lot of time on the, king part of it. Just know, I would recommend, going and if there's several brief articles that talk about the highlights of it. Basically know that they were running, um, a, um, pedophile ring, and it had ties to, uh, like I said, the Bush White House, the senior, um, uh, Neil Bush was involved in it, uh, so she spends the next little, few pages going over that. I'm not gonna go over that, um, and let's see where we pick up at. Um, one of the guy that was involved in it was, let's see, you have a guy by the name of Spence, um, what's his first name? Let me look back here at his first name. Um, I try to circle the names because once they say their name once, then she doesn't repeat their first name. So, anyway, um, I think his first name was Robert Spence. Um, he had gotten all kinds of money and buys, um, a huge big piece of property in Washington, DC, and becomes a prominent lobbyist, that was involved in this whole network. Um, there would seem to be an inexhaustible demand in Washington for the sort of thing Mr. Spence offers, and Spence's personal phone book and party guest list constituted the who's who in Congress, government, and journalism. Spence had a reputation for, throwing very lavish parties. Uh, he was one of Richard Nixon's friends. It was revealed just 7 years afterwards that by the New York Times that his glittery parties for key officials of the Reagan and Bush administration, media stars, and top military officers had been bugged in order to compromise guests. After this explosive report in the Washington Times, Spence was linked to a homosexual prostitution ring whose clients included government officials, locally based U.S. military officers, businessmen, lawyers, bankers, congressional aides, media representatives, and other professionals. Spence also offered cocaine to his guests as another means of acquiring blackmail. Spence's home was bugged and had secret two-way mirrors. Sounds like Jeffrey Epstein before Jeffrey Epstein. Um, he attempted to ensnare visitors into compromising sexual encounters that he could leverage. He sent a limousine to his, let's see, one man who spoke to the Times said that Spence had sent a limousine to his house, which took him to a party where several young men tried to become very friendly with him. Spence was known to offer guests young children for sex to blackmail. Um, let's see. So a Reagan official and an Air Force sergeant had attended one of Spencer's parties, confirmed that Spence's house was filled with recording equipment. Spence's alleged connections to US intelligence, particularly the CIA, where he had boasted that he worked for the CIA. He was quite paranoid about his alleged work for the agency as he expressed concern that the CIA might double-cross him and kill him instead, and then make it look like a suicide. Long after the Washington Times report on his activity was published, Spence fell from grace and was later found dead in a Boston Ritz-Carlton. His death was ruled what? Wait for it, suicide. Um, Spence had spoken of smuggling cocaine into the US from El Salvador. Spence, however, um, let's see, he was able to gain he was able to enter the White House late at night, and then this is the part where they were talking about the, call boys that had been brought into the White House after hours, top level access, to officials, and he specifically singled out George H.W. Bush, then Security Advisor Donald Gregg, Gregg. Gregg had worked at the CIA since 1951 before he resigned in, '82 to become the National Security Advisor to Bush, who was then Vice President. Um, Gregg did not resign. He was basically still a CIA agent working for Bush as his national security advisor. Much like we found out during the Trump administration, the CIA had officers in the administration. Greg would work directly under William Casey, um, and in the late '70s had worked alongside a young William Barr in stonewalling the Pike Committee and the Church Committee, who was investigating the CIA at the time. CIA love traps or sexual blackmail operations used to lure foreign diplomats to bug departments was kind of a routine thing. The Washington Times article on this affair stated that there had been official inquiry into Spence's activity and blackmail. However, it appeared to imply that the Department of Justice was managing the inquiry and that it had a conflict of interest. Yeah, think? Here's a quote. The Office of U.S. Attorney General Jay Stevens, former deputy White House counsel to President Reagan, is coordinating federal aspects of the inquiry, but refused to discuss the investigation or grand jury actions. Several former White House colleagues of Mr. Stevens are listed as clients of the homosexual prostitution ring, according to credit card records, and whose persons have confirmed that the charges are in fact theirs. Mr. Stevens' office, after first saying it would cooperate with the Times inquiry, withdrew the offer late yesterday and also declined to say whether Mr. Stevens would recuse himself from the case because of the potential conflict of interest. At least one highly placed Bush administration official and a wealthy businessman who procured homosexual prostitutes from the escort services operated by the ring are cooperating with the investigation, several sources said. Among clients who charged homosexual prostitute services on major credit cards over the past 18 months is Charles Dutch, Dutcher, former associate director of presidential personnel in the Reagan administration, and Paul Balak, labor secretary, Elizabeth Bill's political personnel liaison to the White House. And let me just say, if you are involved in a homosexual prostitute ring, why in the hell are you so freaking dumb that you would use a credit card? Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? You couldn't go get cash so you didn't get caught? You're that stupid? Okay, moving on. Alright, information contained in the report subsequently corroborated by Henry Benson, who operated the largest gay escort service ever uncovered in DC. Vincent was significantly involved with Spence in DC and had received thousands and thousands of dollars a month from Spence for his escorts. Vincent claimed that he had been invited by Spence to his house on numerous occasions and that Vincent witnessed Spence flaunt his whatever, cocaine and little boys. He, Spence, was definitely a pedophile, Vincent would tell Nick Bryant. Spence also showcased his blackmail equipment to Vincent. So, a quote, Spence showed me the hidden secret recording devices that were scattered throughout his home. Spence often alluded to the fact that he was connected to the CIA and that it was obvious to me that he was well connected. There were people at his home who said they were CIA and at least one or two Secret Service agents. I believe that it was some of the CIA operatives who installed Spence's blackmail equipment. Much of Spence's influence came from the House of Representatives and the Senate. He told me he was blackmailing congressmen. I believe that Spence was blackmailing both for the CIA and for his own personal purposes. Benson alleged that the former CIA director William Casey was also a personal friend of Spence's and attended his parties. Casey, according to him, Casey had been one of his patrons. In addition to Spence and had begun requesting gay escorts from Vincent in 1986. Vincent stated that Casey's preferred escort was an 18-year-old with minimal body hair and slender swimmer physique. He asserted that Casey also requested underage escorts, which Vincent declined to provide. It would be Vincent's refusal to supply underage escorts to Craig Spence that would bring about his downfall and subsequent arrest. Huh, huh. Spence and Larry King were partners. Larry King is the guy that was from, Omaha and hooked up with the CIA. Spence and King were in business together, and their business was pedophile blackmail. They were transporting children all over the country. They would arrange for children to be flown into DC. Paul Rodriguez, one of the journalists at the Washington Times who had exposed Spence, later told Nick Bryant that Spence and King had been partners. Quote, "I was told by several prostitutes, along with law enforcement, that there were connections between Greg Spence and Larry King. The allegations were that Spence and King hosted parties and were involved in a variety of nefarious activities. The allegations included Spence and King hosting blackmail sex parties that included minors and illegal drug use." Okay, so Larry King had confided to him that he had a client who oh, well, we're not even gonna talk about that. So, also, it is said by Vinson that Larry King was involved in torturing, children and a lot of really gross stuff. So, just suffice it to say, they're heinous, animal, and, okay. The one part that we do need to mention is executive jet aviation, which was supposedly used by Larry King as to ferry those children around. Um, Executive Jet Airways was founded in 1964 by Brigadier General Albert Dick Lassiter, Lassiter. Um, he was known for excitement and fast living. Um, let's see. Executive jet, they call it in here after, is EJA. It was founded in Delaware originally, which would have been convenient if they're piping in kids into DC, but Lassiter moved it to Columbus, Ohio, and he set it up at Lockhorn Air Force Base, which was then Rickenbacker Airport after it was decommissioned as an Air Force base. So Rickenbacker Airport is the same airport, um, Wexner used in all of his dealings that we're gonna get into in the next volume with Jeffrey Epstein. So, co-located at the same airport with Jeffrey Epstein is an airline that is now, um, implicated in ferrying little children around the country. Um, EJA's initial board of directors included people like Jimmy Stewart, James Smith, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and, um, former chairman of the Rockefeller Family Oil, Monroe Rathbone. At the time of its founding, it was a closely held secret that EJA had been financed by American Contract Company, a wholly owned subsidiary of Pennsylvania Railroad. In 1965, the company adopted the name Executive Jet Aviation and created a subsidiary in Switzerland. The Swiss subsidiary was led by Paul Tibbets, and Tibbets, of course, is the guy that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and flew the Enola Gay. By 1967, Tibbets and others left EJA. Tibbets allegedly left because he believed some things that were going on that were flagrantly illegal. So, you now have and Switzerland, of course, is a hotbed of hot mess with money laundering and, pedophilia and all of that other stuff. So, now we've set up the connection that it's an international, um, uh, capability through this one airline. So, at the same time, the parent company of American Contract Company, the Pennsylvania Railroad, merged with New York Central Railroad, and, basically, that's Rockefeller. And, um, there's CIA-linked David, um, Baird Foundation, BAIRD. Um, Penn Central would collapse in 1971, becoming one of the biggest bankruptcies in US history, referred to as bankruptcy fraud with organized crime overtures. So, um, a Washington attorney with ties to Lassiter, who set up EJA board of directors, would be responsible for the covert marriage between Pennsylvania Pennsylvania Railroad and EJA. Their joining was performed by, um, Glor Organ? Organ's vice president was General Charles Hodge, a Wall Street broker who was also the chief investment advisor to Penn Central and sat on the board of the executive jet. So, Lore Horgan is a term that was used by William Casey in his business adventure, Multiponics, that we talked about in chapter 6. So, again, you've got the CIA involved. Um, Penn Central linked to Executive Jet eventually emerged that Lassiter attempted to obtain a certificate that would have allowed him to operate a much larger aircraft, but at the time, you were not allowed to have a railroad and air carrier, so that was blocked. Um, since he was barred from using the larger jets for domestic operation, Lassiter leased them to International Air Bahama, a Liechtenstein corporation, which means money laundering. He had persuaded a number of foreign investors to organize, which offered cut rate service between Nassau and Luxembourg. Huh. However, although the money was being made, least money wasn't getting back to Executive executive jet. The money Lassiter raised, said Tibbets, allowed him to live like a millionaire. So, basically, they're most likely running drugs, money laundering, all of that stuff. Um, so, in 1970, Bruce Senlin, the attorney for Executive Jet's board of director, who first connected the company to Penn Central, um, had raided, Executive Jet's offices as the company had began its descent. Sunland reportedly came across a large stack of photographs that showed Lassiter in the company of various young women, all of them very pretty and well endowed. Um, Congressional hearings involved questions directed at Lassiter about the procurement of women for Bevan and Hodges, which was allegedly performed by Riccardi, Ricciardi, and that guy had testified in '68 that he had procured these women to relieve the pressure they were exerting on Mr. Lassiter to get the company back in the black. So, I don't know why you're hiring these women unless it's for blackmail to set them up. Congressman J.W. Wright Patman, a Democrat from Texas, stated that the executive jet role in Penn Central collapse raised some serious questions about the involvement of commercial banking industry in the strange and far-flung operations of executive jet aviation. Yeah, think? Okay, so after the let's see, Penn Central collapsed, it reemerged in '77, but not as a railroad, as an energy, recreation, and real estate company. A year later, it was disclosed that the corporate raider Paul Steinberg, um, who had previously tried to acquire Robert excuse me, Maxwell's Paragon Press, had obtained excuse me, 8% of the new incarnated Penn Central, which grew to about 13% a year later, and that the Cincinnati financier Carl Lindner obtained 30% of the company, which included Steinberg's position. Lindner became chairman of Penn Central in '83. The boat broker who did these trades were Drexel Burnham Lambert, Michael Milken. Also involved was Randall Smith at Bear Stearns, basically known as vulture capitalist. So, Lindner had been involved in, um, other business deals with Louis Rosenthal that we talked about back in, chapter 2, and they had connections to Jack DeVoe, the cocaine smuggler, as DeVoe maintained his planes at a club and airstrip that Lindner owned. In addition, the year after Lindner became president of Penn Central, Lindner Jr. would be given the reins of United Brands, the CIA front company, by Max Fisher, who had been in charge of it at the time. Oh, man, what a network. Um, Tibbets ends up coming back to the company, uh, and Tibbets was still serving as president when Executive Jet was acquired by Richard Santulli. Previously, Santulli had served as the president of Goldman Sachs' leasing division, which bought helicopters, airplanes, and then leased them to companies. Santulli left in '80 to create his own leasing company, RTS Capital Services. EJ so Executive Jet became a subsidiary to Santulli's company and was later renamed NetJets. And NetJets is, the one that Earthschild, Hathaway is heavily involved in. So, executive jets eventually becomes NetJets through a whole bunch of iterations. That's hilarious. Wonder if they're still, trafficking kids. Um, in 1993, 2 of the executive jet pilots recruited by Leslie Wexner at the Limited was Eric Black and let's see, they were transporting checks for the Federal Reserve. He returned to executive Jet's Columbus location. He had been working in Miami, and then he goes back to Columbus. Um, then he was hired as a pilot for the Limited, which is Wexner. Black is now the lead pilot for the L brand flights, which is the Limited. Another pilot, Mike Crater, joined the Limited from Executive Jet, and her point here is basically the flow back and forth of people that are involved in known, um, operations of one kind, moving to known operations of another kind. So, um or of the same kind, if you wanna believe that Jeffrey Epstein was yeah, while he was involved with Lex Wexner was also still trafficking, um, young girls around. So, that's the connection. '93 was a curious time for the Limited, especially with air freight concerns. The Limited was courted by a company called Polar Air Cargo, which sought to install itself also at the Rickenbacker Airstrip. Polar Air Cargo was a joint venture of Nedmark Transportation, Polaris Aircraft Leasing Corporation, and the now infamous CIA-linked airline Southern Air Transport. At the time, more than half of Polar Air Cargo employees had been former Flying Tiger employees with ties to Ann Chennault and Robert Gray and the CIA, because that's basically what the Flying Tigers were doing. We figured out in Burma they were flying the drugs in and out. We know that because of Operation Gladio. The Limited, with direct input from Jeffrey Epstein, would be a largely responsible for the relocation of Southern Airport or Air Transport to Rickenbacker in 1995, and Southern Air Transport is the CIA. So, that's the end of that. Um, that's crazy, okay? That finishes our first volume, and, I I hope you guys are enjoying our discovery of all of these ties into, um, how how big the organization is, um, how international the organization is, and how complicit the people that people keep looking to Congress to do something. They're not going to do anything because they're all compromised. Um, that's kind of the big elephant in the room, if you will. And I don't know if y'all saw the, connection that I just made on, I didn't make it. Somebody sent me all of the news articles, who used to live in Little Rock. And all the stuff that we've been talking about, we're gonna get to Mark Middleton, who was the guy that signed Jeffrey Epstein in 17 times into the Clinton White House, and, his connection to a venture capital fund, which is basically in large part used for money laundering, and he's the guy that in midsummer ended up we were first told, suicide, that he had hung himself when in fact he had not hung himself. He had been shot, had an electrical cord wrapped around his neck, and, he basically had been murdered outside of Little Rock, about an hour away on a ranch that somehow is a nonprofit connected to Walmart, and the girl that, um, had been seen with him shortly before she disappears. She's found she supposedly went out paddleboarding. Her paddleboard was found. She was found with a cement block with an electrical cord tied around her neck, um, in the river that she lived on. What I found interesting in the connection that I made when, this friend of mine sent me this information, um, also, weirdly enough, you have within 6 months of each other, these people dying. She was, killed in January, he was killed, like, in the June timeframe, both having electrical cords. Now we know the significance of how they murder people, um, that has something to do with who's actually conducting the murder. And just like the yellow or the orange rope with Calvi and the, mace and stones in his pocket, that tells you who's doing it. Um, so and they stage them as suicides. So when she sent me this, today, I was thinking paddleboard because I had already said something about I don't remember how anyway, we were talking about the incident at, um oh, I do know. She had sent me a screenshot of the article that Judicial Watch had sent that talked about there had been Arkansas Secret Service members on Obama's estate. That's weird. Normally, like, I know when I was stationed in Georgia, his Secret Service contingent there one of the guys that used to be a driver for them, he had retired and had an executive limousine. He was always the driver that I ended up getting, to drive me to Atlanta when I went on all my business trips, and, he liked to talk a lot. So, I know that people get, like, the gigs, like the guys that are at Kenny Bunkport, unless they want to move, they generally stay there for a long period of time. So, if somebody is saying that the Secret Service from Arkansas are so they probably have some I don't know who that is still related to Clinton living in Arkansas, um, or if they were there I don't the library, I don't know. But why would they be at Obama's house when the cook, um, falls off falls off of a paddleboard? And I think it awful interesting that we know because of Operation Gladio that surface warfare, training is given to Gladio operators at Fort Bragg, and, Canary Islands did the water schools and stuff like that, so we know they get that training. So, there was a video I watched about, the Freddie lady that did the Obama's birth certificate, how she survived a plane crash, but then she dies in the water that's not even over her head, um, and people were making the allegations, and it was very the video was very well done. I don't know if it was real or not, that it was likely that someone, um, had been nearby and swept her under. It's very likely that the same thing could have happened to Obama's chef. Now, and one of our big things here that we've figured out is you look for patterns. So, we don't have a whole lot of people dying in weird circumstances off of paddle boards, um, and not that people don't die, while paddleboarding. I just think it's awful weird that last in 2022, you have this woman who died, electrical cord tied to the guy who shot and electrical cord, um, all tied to Clinton. And then you have Little Rock Secret Service people at Obama's estate who supposedly help in trying to rescue this guy. The whole weird thing about both of the boats not working, to me, they had to have been disabled. One of the big things in the military is, Um, you check those things routinely to make sure that when you need them in an emergency, they work in an emergency. Well, in the emergency, they didn't work, either one of them. Come on, that's garbage. Um, so the whole thing as you start laying it out, one of those things could be weird. Two of those things are totally crazy, but all of those things all laid out, and then as she pointed out also, the just in case the husband didn't get the, message to not be talking to anybody about what had happened, the place where they're going to have her wake, her celebration of life the night before burns to the ground. That's crazy. So you don't have every single one of those things all happening, and they're not you have to look for patterns. I don't know if that is a pattern. I thought the whole thing was weird. It's definitely weird. Whether they're connected or not, I don't know. I wanna throw those things out there because I want all of us to be looking for patterns, in order to be able to connect the dots. That's it. We're finished with book 1 of Whitney Webb's book. Thank you guys for all being here. Appreciate it. Um, and, we'll do some more tomorrow. Yeah, too much of a coincidence. I honestly think so. Every single thing about that supposedly he was a good swimmer, the water was not deep, so did somebody knock him off and hold him under? Um, and would that be the first time something like that happened with Obama? No. Um, yeah, totally weird. So, anyway, thank you guys for being here. I'm gonna sign off, and we'll see you when, and thanks for your patience, for the audio. I apologize for that. Um, anyway, have a nice evening, and I will see you tomorrow.